It's crazy how much of our world today, like how our economies work, is still shaped by Karl Marx, you know?
Hmm.
Capital, that first volume, came out way back in 1867.
Yeah, 1867.
But it's like this huge foundation for how we think about everything.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a dense book, no question.
Yeah.
But what we really want to do in this deep dive is sort of pull out the key ideas from Capital,
Right.
the stuff that's going to help us all understand, the modern economy and how it works
Right.
without, needing to go back and do a PhD in 19th century economics or something like that.
Right, exactly. So, like, let's jump into it.
Okay.
I think a good place to start is with, I think, one of Marx's sort of key ideas, and one of the things he was most critical of, which was this idea of surplus value.
Yeah.
Can you kind of unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So surplus value, I mean, at its core, we need to understand the labor theory of value.
Okay.
This is the idea that the value of a commodity is determined by how much labor went into making it. So how much, socially necessary labor time went into producing this commodity. Now, surplus value is kind of like the extra value that workers produce
Okay.
on top of the value that they're paid in wages.
Got it.
And so because, the capitalist owns the means of production, like the factories and the machinery and all that stuff,
Right.
they get to keep that extra value that the worker produces.
Okay, so in other words, it's like the worker puts in a full day's worth of work, but their wages only represent like a fraction of the value
Right.
they actually produced.
Yeah,
And that extra bit goes to the capitalist.
exactly.
And that sounds like that's where the exploitation part comes in.
Yes, absolutely. Marx argued that this extraction of surplus value from workers was fundamental to how capitalism functions as a system.
Right, right.
So workers are only paid for the cost of, basically keeping them alive and able to come to work the next day.
Right, to reproduce their labor.
Right, exactly, to reproduce their labor power. But they work, much longer than that, and all that extra work, all that extra value they produce goes to the capitalist.
So it's like their compensation only covers their basic needs,
Right.
but they're working beyond that, and that excess labor is where the profit comes from for the owner.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing that's, I think, really crucial to understand is that capital isn't just like an economics textbook or something.
Yeah.
It's actually a critique of political economy.
Okay.
So it's like a critique of the way economics was being done at the time.
Mm.
And Marx's argument was that, the way economists talked about markets and exchange
Right.
kind of ignored this underlying power dynamic
Okay.
between the capitalists and the workers.
Got it.
And so for Marx, capital wasn't just like piles of money or machines or,
Right.
it was fundamentally a social relation.
Interesting. So it's about that power dynamic involved in production.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, he also talked about this thing called the circuit of capital, right?
Yes, exactly.
Which describes kind of this constant drive, the cycle within capitalism.
Right. So the circuit of capital, it goes like this. Money, or M,
Okay.
is used to buy commodities, C.
Commodities being.
Yeah, commodities being things like raw materials, also labor power.
Okay.
Those commodities are then used to produce new commodities, C prime, he called it,
T prime. Okay.
which are more valuable,
Yep,
right?
Okay.
And then those are sold for more money, M prime.
Him prime. Okay.
So you have this cycle, MCCM. And the whole point is
Yeah.
expansion, accumulation, getting more and more and more money.
So it's like this constant drive for growth.
Yes, exactly.
Now, within that, he also talked about, I think it was constant capital versus variable capital.
Yeah, that's right. So constant capital refers to things like machinery.
The actual, like the tools in the factories.
Yeah, the stuff that doesn't change its value
Okay.
during the production process.
Yeah.
But then there's variable capital, and that's what you're paying the workers. And for Marx, only variable capital, that is labor power, is what can create new value.
I see. So it's like the machines are important, but it's the labor that actually makes stuff more valuable.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, all this kind of leads into this this idea of commodity fetishism, which sounds kind of tricky.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea.
What's so strange about commodities, according to Marx?
So commodity fetishism is this idea that under capitalism, we tend to see commodities, the products we buy,
Yeah.
as having this kind of inherent value,
Right.
like it's magical or something.
Okay.
But what we forget is that those commodities are actually the product of human labor.
So we focus on the product itself, not the process or the people.
Exactly. We focus on the price tag, the brand name, the features, all of that.
Mm.
But we don't necessarily think about, the workers who assembled it, the miners who dug up the raw materials,
Right. It's like, I'm thinking about my phone. Like, I think about all the cool stuff it can do,
Yep.
but I don't think about the people who actually put it together.
Exactly. And that's what commodity fetishism is.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, that's fascinating. So now I've got the engine of capitalism running. We've got some of these weird side effects.
Right.
Now, Capital itself, it's actually broken down into 3 volumes, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So what does each volume actually cover?
So volume 1 is all about production.
Okay.
How surplus value is extracted from workers, how capital accumulates, all of that.
Okay.
Volume 2 is all about circulation,
Meaning?
like how commodities are bought and sold in the market, how, money flows through the system,
Okay, okay.
that kind of thing.
The whole cycle.
Yeah, exactly. And then volume 3 is kind of the big picture,
Okay.
is looking at how surplus value gets transformed into profit, how profit rates tend to fall over time, and the role of things like finance, banking, and land ownership in the system.
Okay, so with all this going on, what were Marx's sort of big predictions for like where capitalism was heading?
Yeah, so Marx saw what he called inherent contradictions
Okay.
within capitalism. It's kind of like built-in problems.
Right.
So one of these contradictions was between the forces of production, like technology, and the ability to produce more and more stuff,
Okay.
and the relations of production, like the social relationships between capitalists and workers.
I see.
So basically, Marx thought that capitalism would keep getting better and better at producing stuff,
Right.
but that it wouldn't be able to keep up in terms of creating enough demand
Okay.
for all that stuff.
So it would run into like limits.
Yeah, exactly. And this would lead to economic crises, recessions, depressions.
Booms and busts.
Exactly. Booms and busts. He also saw this fundamental conflict between the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, and the working class, the proletariat.
Due to the exploitation we were talking about before.
Exactly. And so he famously said, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. And ultimately, he thought that these contradictions would lead to a breakdown of capitalism.
Like a total collapse.
Yeah, and that it would be replaced with a communist society, a society where, there's no private property and resources are distributed based on need rather than profit.
So that's a pretty dramatic prediction, a pretty dramatic forecast for where things are headed.
Absolutely.
What was the impact of Capital? It seems like it really stirred things up.
Oh, it had a huge impact. I mean, it's one of the most influential books ever written.
Really?
Yeah. It basically laid the foundation for Marxist economics. It inspired socialist and communist movements all over the world.
Okay.
And it had a really profound influence on the way we think about, society, power, inequality, all these things.
Right. But I'm guessing it wasn't without its critics, right?
Oh, of course not.
What were some of the big pushbacks against Marx's ideas?
Yeah. I mean, the labor theory of value, which we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
it's been heavily debated.
Yeah.
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 Some people think it's a good explanation of value. Other people don't.
Got it.
Also, obviously Marx's prediction that capitalism would inevitably collapse hasn't really happened.
At least not yet.
Yeah. Not in the way that he imagined it.
Right, right.
So there's that. There's also, some people who think that Marx's analysis was maybe a bit too focused on economics,
Oh, okay.
and that he didn't pay enough attention to other factors like, culture or politics.
I see.
But despite all the criticism, Capital is still being read and debated today
Right.
by economists, by political scientists, by philosophers,
By everybody, yeah.
yeah, basically everybody. It's still incredibly relevant.
Yeah, even if you don't agree with everything Marx said, it's still a really powerful way to look at the world, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because
Yeah.
like a whole new vocabulary, for thinking about
Right.
the way capitalism works and
Power dynamics, yeah.
the power dynamics, yes.
And I think it's especially interesting to think about, how some of those contradictions that Marx talked about
Yeah.
are maybe playing out today in new ways, with things like automation and artificial intelligence and, the growing gap between rich and poor.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes Capital so interesting to read today, is that it raises all these questions
Yeah.
that are still really relevant to our world.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us. It's been a fascinating look at one of the most influential books ever written.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, everybody.